If you have the ability to completely switch out of a practice that you experience these things that make you feel unsafe, do it. Because feeling safe is the most important piece of the puzzle when it comes to having a baby and reducing trauma, having a positive birth experience. If you feel unsafe, if you feel unseen, unheard, if you feel violated in any way, you do not feel safe with those people delivering your babies.
Welcome to the Birth Education Center podcast, hosted by myself, Care Messer, an entrepreneur, birth educator, and doula. My team and I want to help you discover your options in birth and postpartum, how to find your voice, and how to use that voice to navigate our maternal healthcare system. You and your baby are not just a number. This information includes doulas too. Now let's get started.
I just have to start this episode off laughing because every time Ashley and I get on, because we're doing it on video as well, there's always some kind of makeup conversation or, oh my God, I look so shiny or whatever it is, because it's not just audio. Can you just repeat what you just said as you were touching your eyebrows?
That I'm fighting with my eyebrows and I just keep trying to remind myself, sisters, not twins, sisters, not twins, because
so
they both each have a life of their own. So
yeah, well, at least you have eyebrows.
It's a constant battle.
The older I get, the thinner and whiter they get. So I don't know. That has nothing to do with the conversation we're having today. But today we are revisiting provider red flags because we talk about it in class all the time. We talk about it on the internet all the time. And we also have touched on it in several episodes. However, things even have come up this week in my class where I'm like, oh my gosh, we got to go deeper. So we understand that a lot of times we don't have the option of switching providers. We live in a small town. There's one doc for the whole place. We're driving 2 hours because there aren't any docs in our place, and that's where we have to go. But there are a lot of us who can switch. So there's going to be part of the conversation for you as well. All the provider red flags need to be on your radar so that you can know how to navigate the conversation. And obviously, once again, I'm going to tell you and say and scream that the more education you have outside the hospital system in a class series that's not sponsored by a hospital, you're going to understand what your options are, have conversations with your teacher or instructor about how to find your voice, build your confidence, state your needs, state your preferences, not negotiate what you want, but let them be known. And we just want you to have all the facts so that when you go to appointments starting in the early days, you can kind of start filtering like, that was a little off for me. There's something in my stomach that went, like that. And obviously, I want to put this out in February or March because a lot of you got pregnant over Christmas and the holidays, and a lot of you got pregnant over Valentine's Day. So the earlier you get this information, the better off you're going to be. So that's where I want to start with the conversation.
Yeah. And I mean, we know that you all have different relationships with your care provider. As Cara said, some of us have the luxury of having a lot of options. Some of us don't. And the point of this conversation isn't to terrify you, but to empower you to feel like, okay, if I can look out for these things, these pitfalls, these red flags, these things that can come up in conversation, it's going to actually help you navigate those conversations. If you can be alert and listen for it, then you will know how to think about and respond to it. And if they build up and there's a lot of red flags piling up on this care provider, and if you have the opportunity to look for something else, hopefully this episode will inspire you to maybe look elsewhere. And we'll talk about throughout this episode some reasons why. Why might you jump ship on a care provider and look for somebody else? Early pregnancy, mid-pregnancy, end of pregnancy. Cara and I have clients and students who switch providers all the time because they all of a sudden hit a crossroads where red flags are popping up and they realize, wait a second, this person is not entitled to be at my birth. I'm allowed to have a say in who attends my birth. And that's really what we're trying to do here.
And at the end, we'll cover how you can switch, like what conversations to have and what not conversations to have. But I want to start off with you really understanding that you're not a number in this system unless you want to be a number in the system. You have every right as an autonomous human being to say yes or no to anything right from the beginning. And you're hiring these care providers to offer suggestions, guidance, safety measures for your pregnancy. Your pregnancy itself is not a medical condition. It's a natural process. It's something that happens to all of us when we're gestating a baby. There may be certain conditions, gestational diabetes, hypertension, things like that, that need to be treated. But your pregnancy overall, especially if you're healthy and moving forward with no big hiccups, that is not medical treatment. It's just overseeing guidance and suggestions. You have the right to informed consent, understanding everything about what they're suggesting, and also the right to informed refusal. And that means, no, thank you. I appreciate it. There's something that came out in 2015 called shared decision making, which is now being taught in medical school. It's fairly relatively new. However, it's the new standard of care. So we want you to kind of hear this first as a filter as to what information you're getting from your care provider and what conversations you're having, because it's a really good way of assessing, ooh, I'm not being heard right now. So I'm going to link this and the actual whole document called Informed Consent and Shared Decision Making in Obstetrics and Gynecology. It's the committee opinion number 819, put out February of 2021. That'll have all this in there. But let's start with, there's an acronym called SHARE. So number 1, S, is seek your patient's participation. Number 2 is help your patient explore and compare the treatment options. Number 3, assess your patient's values and preferences. This is a time when you get to share, oh, that doesn't really align with what I want to do. 4, R, reach a decision with your patient. Shared decision making. You guys are going to be talking about this. And 5 is E, evaluate your patient's decision. Know that whatever you choose at the end of the day is your choice. A doctor cannot override that choice. You can say yes or no to anything. If it is a life-saving thing where you are not available to make a choice, obviously they're going to go to your next of kin, next person that's with you, usually your partner, to help with that evaluation and decision making. But you have the right to say yes or no to anything. And you also have the right to all the information presented to you in understandable, concrete things that you understand. And a lot of times that's not done. And we see it as doulas and educators all the time. And it's very frustrating because if you were getting cancer treatment, it would probably be explained to you in a much clearer way than it is in maternity care, which is probably one of the reasons we lose more moms and babies every single year, and that number keeps climbing. So I encourage you to go into the show notes, click this link, and read through it thoroughly and understand how this co-care and shared decision-making should be working with your provider. Because if it was, oh my gosh, we would be having much different experiences in our doctor's appointments.
That is such a great jumping off point to dive into these red flags. And we're just going to go one by one, sharing with you the things that we have seen come up with our families, with our students. And of course, if you want to add to the conversation and think of things that we don't think of, you can always let us know.
There's always more. There's always
more. That's what I was going to say. I'm sure there's some that we haven't thought of, but these are really the big ones that I feel like you can be on the lookout for, that we have seen lead to patterns of treatment, that if you hear these things or recognize these things, you can make a shift. So that's what we're here to help you look out for. So the first one is, you didn't research or choose your provider. You called your insurance and told them you were pregnant, and they said, okay, here's an OB in your area who's taking patients. And that's who you went to. This really means that you didn't either have the opportunity or think about the fact that you should research your care provider before you hire them. And so many of us are in this boat where we call our insurance or we look on our insurance website and we go to the first one who pops up, kind of sight unseen or sight unresearched.
Or we just pick a female provider because we don't want a male provider, not knowing anything about the female provider.
Right. Or we pick the one that's the closest between our home and our workplace because we know we're going to have to squeeze these appointments in. There's all kinds of reasons why we just are going down a list and pointing at one and going with it. I know I did. That's exactly what I did in my pregnancy. I picked the closest available female provider to me. And ultimately, because of the nature of my pregnancy, she didn't end up being my provider anyways. But once I became a doula, and I started doing births at the facility she delivered at, and I worked with her a couple of times, I realized, whoa, did I dodge a bullet by getting pregnant with triplets and being out of her scope of practice, because she did not align with what I was looking for in my own birth or in the births that my clients were having. So it's great to have a resource, especially if you're new to an area or you're new to an insurance, to have a list of providers to choose from, but make sure you're going through those names and Yelping them or Googling them and seeing what comes up before you just book an appointment with one of them.
Or go to your Facebook local moms group and say, anyone know anything about these two providers? If there's only two in your town, everybody in there has delivered with them. So ask what their experiences were.
Yeah, even in your Facebook mom groups, you can put their name in the search bar and see what comes up in past posts. There's a lot of different ways to find information in this amazing age of the internet about providers so that we are not going in blind to these different appointments. That's a huge one. If you find yourself in that situation where you know you didn't have a lot of say in choosing this provider, we really want you to think about that. We want you to take this opportunity now to search your provider. We want you to think, how did I end up here? Because it doesn't necessarily mean this is where the road ends and this is the provider that you're stuck with, right? The next big one is you want a natural birth. And the provider you're with or the provider you chose was somebody who came highly recommended to you by friends or neighbors or people on Facebook who all had highly medicalized births or cesareans. And they love that doctor. They love their provider. But when you go through the list of the people that recommended them to you, you realize, all of these people had the exact birth I don't want. And there's nothing wrong with wanting a medicalized birth. There's nothing wrong with wanting a cesarean. But if you want a natural birth, is that the provider you should have? Is the one that they love for their scheduled cesareans or their scheduled inductions or their all the things births? Because you're not going to align with what you're hoping for your birth experience.
I always think it's funny too. It's just so foreign to me because I'm on this side of the coin that we have to request a provider that supports natural birth. This is what we've done since the beginning of time. And yet we have to seek out a provider who actually believes that our bodies can do it and that will support it. Because we are so medicalized now. We are so used to having that control, which you really can't control it and it gets out of control really quick. But the idea that if we induce or we schedule or we whatever, we can control all these different circumstances when we really can't. But it's interesting to me that natural birth is secondary to the medicalized birth because it makes so much money.
Yeah. I mean, in San Diego, there's a research-based facility that all of the OB residents who come through there, they do a cycle with the midwives in the birth center so they can see natural births. And if they were not at that school, if they were not in that program, that is not something they would be exposed to. And I worked with a med student dad in that program who went to birth center births and came home and told his wife, just like in tears, this is how you're supposed to have a baby. It's so connected. The families are together. It's so beautiful. And then they went on to have a birth center birth together, even though he was a doctor, because he was able to see how birth can be and how you can be treated in birth. And here where I am in Oregon, I actually just experienced this at another research-based facility where whenever the midwives would come in to take care of my client, they would ask, hey, we bring family med docs with us. Is that okay with you? Are you okay with them shadowing us? We really want them to learn about how birth can be a more hands-off process, about how birth can be respectful, about how the body works. And the doctors shadow the midwives in this program. And really, only in places like that are you going to get doctors who understand natural birth. Many obstetricians will go their entire lives through medical school and residency without seeing an unmedicated birth. Or they'll see like accidental unmedicated births, but they'll still be on their backs, legs in stirrups, all of those things. It's just not something they're exposed to. When they're getting into medicine, they're getting into that rescuer role for the most part. They're there to help people, right? That's what most people are going to tell you about why they become doctors. But as Care said in the beginning, and what we constantly try to reiterate to our families is if you are healthy and your baby is healthy, your pregnancy doesn't need help. Your birth doesn't need help. It just needs support. And that is not something that most obstetricians are trained to do, is support. They're there to help. They're there to rescue. And even if they have the best of intentions, they can be a lot of unnecessary interventions that take place. And so making sure that you are trying to find somebody in your area who not only has experience with normal birth, unmedicated birth, the type of birth that you want, but that they are truly supportive of it. Not that it's something that happens sort of accidentally occasionally in their practice, because you'll find that all the time. The longer doctors practice, the more second, third, fourth time moms they work with, the more, oops, the baby fell out births they're going to see. But we, especially as first time parents, really need that support of somebody who's like, I believe you can do it the first time around and have your baby the way you want to have it.
Well, and even if you want a medicalized birth, if you go to a provider who supports natural birth, you're probably going to have less interventions. You're probably going to have better appointments because the pep talks are different, right? It's just a different experience. Even if you want all the medical things, you're going to have probably a better, more emotionally connected experience if you have a doc that understands how natural birth and physiological birth works.
Exactly. I tell our students and my clients that all the time. That is, I understand that you want everything. You want everything that they have to offer. You're like, my insurance is paying for this. Run up the tab, as they say. But you're right. If you're with a provider who is experienced in all kinds of birth, from unmedicated natural birth to family-centered cesareans and everything in between, you're going to get a lot more respect. You're going to have a lot more autonomy. You're going to have a lot more say in how you're treated. And you're really going to get that shared decision-making approach from your provider. Our next one has a few points to it. And I purposely, as I was thinking about this episode, did not separate these points from each other because they all go together. They all inform each other because they're all a symptom of the same issue, which is very large provider groups. Southern California is known for this. I've experienced it here in the Pacific Northwest as well. Is large provider groups that feed into hospitals where the doctors share shifts in the hospital. Almost nobody attends their own birth. I don't want to say nobody. San Diego has a few unicorns. I'm sure every place has a few unicorns that do attend all their own births, or it's a small town and they have to attend all their own births because they're the only ones. But really what has become the industry standard is a large group of providers who take their assigned shifts in a calendar month, and they're there every Tuesday night or Tuesday night and Thursday morning. And other than that, they're not at the hospital catching babies. They're sharing clinic duties. And so when you go in for your appointments, you're rotated between different doctors, or you see one doctor the whole time, but they're not going to be the one who delivers your baby. And even if you're rotated between all the doctors, there's so many in the practice, there's literally no way for you to meet them all. And if you don't vibe with some of them, there's no way for you to say, hey, I'd prefer that person didn't deliver my baby, because they all share shifts and it's random who's going to be there. The things that come with this unfortunate approach, which it is better for the doctors in terms of them getting sleep, having more time with their families, not being overly exhausted, but it has taken a lot of that personal care out of this practice of obstetrics, which, as you know, we've been hammering home over and over and over again, is about support. It's not about treatment necessarily. And so when you take away that personal piece of getting to know your provider and knowing your provider is going to be the one who delivers your baby, then the support aspect is eroded. It's breaking down because there's no way to truly get support if your provider's not there. And they may say, hey, we all practice the same, right? Me and my coworkers, we all take the same approach. That's not true. That's never true. That's the human element of this, is that when you have a group of 25 providers or 10 providers or even 6 providers, there's no way they're all going to be the same. There's no way they're all going to take the same approach. And you'll hear many, many, many providers, if they're honest, talk about how subjective obstetrics is, and how if you had 10 doctors and asked them about a scenario, they would all 10 give you different answers if you asked them individually, because they would all take different approaches. Some would take a much more holistic hands-off approach, and some are very interventionist, and most are somewhere in between. And so when you have a practice that you're going to with so many doctors in it, there's just no guarantee of the type of care or treatment you're going to receive in the hospital. And Kara and I have been dealing with this for the last decade, working together with families in these large practice groups of being like, wow, this doctor who walked into this birth is just like a walking red flag. What a scary person. What a terrible experience. We had one doctor local to San Diego that was particularly abusive to partners and doulas, any support people who were in the room for the birth. And we have doctors that just have the same sort of lines that they use on people every time they walk into a birth. And so then you're going to these births at these large hospitals just praying that's not the one who walks in. But these large practices make it so we don't have a say, and neither do our clients, over who walks into those births.
Well, and that's another plug for midwives and the continuity of care you get with midwives, which is why there are so many other places that are better to have births than in America, because they have midwives and continuity of care, which in some countries that's falling away as well because of this lovely system we're in. But knowing who is going to be supporting you and having that support all the way through, and then having them show up and also see you postpartum, makes a huge difference for our experience. And you have to understand the system is not set up for our experience. It is a conveyor belt system set up for money. So you're the one that kind of has to take the lead on creating what you want within this system, because otherwise it's not going to happen.
That's a really good point, bringing up midwives too, because this is another check for what you're talking about finding a provider that support physiological birth and natural births and stuff like that, despite wanting an epidural or things like that. Hospitals that have midwives, number one, have lower C-section rates, lower intervention rates, and just overall healthier birth cultures than facilities that do not have midwives. That has been proven in studies over and over again, the positive influence that midwives have on birth cultures at hospitals. But the other thing is, you are looking at a group of people that is much less subjective and much more cohesive opinions if you have a large group of midwives versus a large group of obstetricians. Why? Because midwives' scope of practice is much smaller, and they are vaginal birth experts. That's all that they do, is vaginal deliveries. So it allows them to have a lot more cohesive opinions. So even if it's still a group of midwives is much more likely to have that continuity of care from provider to provider than a group of obstetricians. And that's been proven. Yeah, we're always team midwife as much as we possibly can be. Of course, midwives are humans, and there's always going to be people, even midwives, that you don't vibe with, that are not on the same page as you. But generally speaking, the data shows that the midwifery model of care in hospitals improves outcomes, it improves birth satisfaction, just across the board. So if you can look for a group that includes midwives or a facility that has midwifery care, you are much more likely to get the birth you're looking for, even if it's still that larger group system. A couple other big symptoms of the large group practice approach is the providers don't really know you. They don't remember your names. They don't remember your family details. They don't remember if you're having a boy or a girl. They don't remember your due date. They don't really know you at all, right? Part of this is because either you're rotating appointments, or what's very, very common in these large practices is most of your appointments are with a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant rather than an OB at all. Even though there's a dozen OBs in the practice, they're so busy, they have so many clients in their practice that they have to give the bulk of their appointments to their NPs and their PAs. Love an NP, love a PA. They're not allowed to deliver babies. So you can fall in love with your nurse practitioner that you see every week. She's not going to be there when you have your baby. He's not going to be there when you have your baby. You've spent all this time building a relationship with someone who cannot be involved in your birth process at all. And then you see your doctor 3, maybe 4 times your whole pregnancy. Is that enough opportunity to talk about your hopes for your birth, to get your questions answered, to really get to know this person or people who are actually going to be delivering your baby? No, it is so incredibly impersonal. And so if you find yourself in a practice where they're like, yeah, you'll see the OB, at this appointment, this appointment, this appointment, but all the other times you're going to see a PA or you're going to see an NP, as lovely as those people might be, that's not supportive care. That's not continuous support. That is leaving a lot in terms of lack of education, lack of information, lack of relationship, which then leads to birth dissatisfaction and birth trauma.
And that's a good shoe in to the next one, which is going over your birth plan, wanting to do that early in the picture, and having a provider brush it off and say, oh, no, 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 we discussed that at the end. We discussed that later. We don't need to look at that right now. But you're at 18 weeks and you have your ideas and you may have taken a little bit of a birth class and you have ideas of what you want, and it's pushed off and pushed off. And even at 35 weeks, it's pushed off. Well, we're going to talk about that at 38 weeks. We'll be fine. That is such a red flag, because by that point, it is so extremely difficult for you to get out of a practice if you need to and switch providers. The earlier you know what their practice does or what they allow or not allow, and once again, that's subjective because you are the one that has the final say. The earlier, the better, the easier it is to get out of that practice or to have some difficult conversations and gear up for what you have in store if that's your only choice.
Yeah. And if you think about it, if you're spending a large amount of time with the PAs and NPs, they're not at the hospital. They can only answer this little bit of your birth plan because they're not actually in the rooms when babies are being born. They're not at the hospital when these procedures are being practiced. So they can't really speak to what takes place in the hospitals because they're not a part of that. They're only clinical providers. And so there isn't even an opportunity to discuss your birth plan with somebody until you see your doctor finally at your 36-week appointment. Okay, well, now I'm 4 weeks out from my due date. And what options do I have? Because my insurance is already paying like the global fee. I've spent most of my pregnancy in this practice. They're not going to let me switch, all of these things. So I would say the very first opportunity you have to start asking about what are their approaches, whether you're drilling the PAs or your NPs at your appointments, hey, this is the type of birth I want. Is that something I'm going to get in this practice? The very first opportunity you have to have a doctor in front of you. I know it's early on, but I want to talk about what I would like to happen in my birth because I need to make sure that this is the right practice for me, and see how forthright they are with you about your birth plan, even if it's just a sample birth plan, right? Find a sample that looks like the birth that you want and see how they respond, because it's going to tell you a lot. See how they respond when you talk about hypnobirthing classes or doulas or any variety of things that maybe are not so typical, because their responses are going to be very telling in terms of how supportive they are.
Delayed cord clamping, natural delivery of the placenta. There's a lot of things that are a little off the norm, beaten path that you may want. And I also want to bring up too, if you're going to be at a birth center in a hospital and you're planning on that, you want that water birth or you want to be laboring the tub or whatever it is at that hospital, there are things towards the end of pregnancy that can X you out of that birth center experience. Ask your midwives what those are early on, because I've seen several times, more times than I want to see, that they didn't know all these things that happened early in their pregnancy would have already kicked them out of the birth center, and they don't find out until 38 weeks. And now they're devastated. And if someone had told them earlier, for one, they could have been prepared, probably stayed at the same hospital, but they would have been like, oh, that's a bummer. And let's work out some different scenarios. And now they could be delivering any day. They're defeated. They feel lied to. And that kind of disrupts all the trust that they've been building the whole time. So in the early days of your choosing that birth center at the hospital, ask them, what are the common things for me being moved over to labor and delivery floor? Just so that you have a broad scope of what those things are. I've also had providers say, oh, we don't need to go over that. You're doing great. Red flag. I want to know. If I had a high blood pressure at 9 weeks and that's kicking me out, but you never told me that, why did you string me along this whole time when I was going to be in labor and delivery? So just ask and have those discussions ahead of time, just so you have an understanding of it.
Exactly. And the next point that comes up for us is, along with asking about those things, if you're looking for a natural birth with midwives, but the more common procedures like cesareans, inductions, episiotomies, which if you don't know what that is, definitely look it up. It's not fun.
And it's not evidence-based.
No, these practices that are constantly recommended by the World Health Organization and other medical organizations to be limited, to be reduced, to be in smaller numbers if possible, because they can cause negative outcomes or poor birth experiences. A lot of providers are very avoidant in talking about what are their C-section rates, what are their induction rates, what are their episiotomy rates, along with what's your unmedicated birth rate, right? Because that low number is not something that they're proud of. And the high numbers are not something that they're proud of, even if it's something that they always feel justified in doing when the writing is on the wall and they have to actually say, oh, my induction rate is 50%. My cesarean rate is over 40%. My episiotomy rate is 15%.
But Ashley, let's be honest. How many docs actually say that? They don't.
That's exactly what I mean, is if they were to actually say those numbers out loud, it would be very hard for them to justify them or be proud of them. They avoid talking about it because those numbers are so high. A doctor that is proud of their numbers, that can stand behind their numbers, and because they know, hey, I have a 50% unmedicated rate. My C-section rate is only 10 to 15%. I don't do episiotomies except in emergencies, so it's not even a percentage rate. They're going to tell you those numbers because they're proud of them. They can stand behind them because they don't do these procedures unnecessarily. And what you're going to find is in these larger practices or these typical OB providers is this avoidance of actually giving numbers or talking about it or putting any sort of percentage on the amount of times they do these. And maybe they even do them so much they can't even calculate it. They don't even keep track of it. They have no idea.
And one thing that I constantly hear is, oh, our practice, we don't induce anybody unless it's medically necessary. So that's not even a topic. You have a perfectly healthy pregnancy. So what does that do to you? You think, oh, they don't induce. That's great. And I'm healthy. So now you've built that thing of I've picked the right provider. There's some trust there. And then at 39 weeks, when all of a sudden looks like your fluids are low and there's this and baby looks really big, we need to get that baby out. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, I didn't want that, but I know they never induce, so I must really need it.
Yeah. And all of a sudden at your pregnancy, you're really old and your placenta is really old and everything's going to explode and we have to intervene.
And it's one of the hardest things, I think, as educators, because we have worked with these docs and we know what's coming down the pike for you. And I'm obviously not going to tell you that because I don't want to disrupt the trust. And you may be the fluke that isn't that in that first scenario. But I also want you to look at, are you healthy? Have you been healthy the whole time? Look at the evidence presented for that induction or for that suggested cesarean or whatever, because it still may not be evidence-based for you. So please sift through that information and know, am I just a number going into this thing that I am saying yes to because I feel like I have trust with my doc? You need to look at your situation at that time and sort through the evidence and your gut feeling as to, is my baby safe? Am I safe?
Exactly. The thing is, you can opt into all of these things if you want to. And we're not saying that nobody can have an induction or nobody can have a cesarean. I don't know why anybody would want an episiotomy, but if that's what you're into, that's fine. But the point is that these procedures, when we talk about evidence, are not highly recommended in terms of everybody should have them. And so it's important to find a provider that you can find based on your own research of them, not just what they say, but hey, when I go on Yelp, when I go on Google, when I go on these Facebook groups, every single person says they had an induction with you. That's 100 people. If you don't do them, why do so many people have inductions? And different states have different resources. I know in California, we have a website that has the rates for all the hospitals, and it has what the recommended numbers should be versus what the hospital's numbers actually are. And there's some hospitals in San Diego that have really great numbers. And yet people are still sort of lulled into going to hospitals that have really high numbers because whether that's their insurance or they're sold the idea that they should be there.
The PR is really good for those hospitals. Let's put it that way.
Exactly. And there's a reason why, right? They have to be invested in getting people in the door because it's a money-making prospect. And really, that's what it comes down to for a lot of these facilities is they're profit-driven. There's a huge difference between research-based facilities and for-profit facilities. And I always tell people, even though the idea of a teaching hospital, maybe somebody watching you when you have your baby or other people potentially being in the room can be a little off-putting, research-based facilities, university models are much more likely to have the numbers that you're looking for to create a better birth experience than profit-driven private hospitals. So keep that in mind in your research and in your search for a provider or in your search for switching providers. even in a teaching hospital, you can say, hey, no students, no observers, but you're going to get the benefit of all of the research that goes into trying to provide the most evidence-based care that those facilities offer. And don't be afraid to ask for numbers. And if they can't give you numbers, they're probably doing too many births. And that's why. So keep that in mind. One thing that can come up when you take the information that we talk about in our podcast or in your classes and start having these conversations with your provider is you can hear language that is in and of itself a huge red flag. And there are certain phrases and keywords that we want you to be on the lookout for to see if this provider is somebody who can be trusted, if this is somebody you can align with, because if they use this language, the odds are very good that you are not going to have an easy time getting what you want. Not to say you can't, because ultimately you have the say in what happens in your body, but it can be much more of an uphill slog and a fight. And we don't want that. We want your birth to be peaceful and calm. And we want a provider that's going to be like, sounds good. That's what you want. Let's do it. That's not how I typically do it, but that's okay. I'm here to roll with you in whatever you want.
Oh my gosh, that would be the best t-shirt. Hey, that's not how I typically do it, but if that's what you want, let's roll with it. Oh my gosh.
I literally hear a certain doctor's voice in my head when I say that.
And I know exactly which doctor.
I think I've heard him say that before. But, and I even just the birth I recently attended, there was an OB involved at one point where they were like, whatever you want. And the family asked for something that is not typically done at that hospital. And they were like, sure, yeah, we can make that happen. Why? Because protocol is not law. Because there's no governing body saying you are not allowed to do these things for families. You are not allowed to make exceptions. So here are the things that you don't want to hear from your provider. If you hear them, I want you to think, am I with the right person? So language, I always do things this way. I always induce, I always do episiotomies, I always XYZ, whatever it is. If they always do things a certain way, that is a sign of a provider that is not evolving.
Not patient-centered, not informed choice.
They're not doing continuing education where they're learning about different approaches that they can take. If they always do things the same way, that is a very dangerous phrase. If we think about any aspect of life, one of the most dangerous phrases to hear ever in any concept is this is how we've always done things. How many things in our past have we said, ooh, that was not such a great idea. I'm really glad we don't still do things that way. And yet in medicine, in so many areas of medicine, we will accept a provider who says, well, this is how I always do it. Even if there's better, more evidence-based practice that has come around, this is how I will always do it. That is such a huge red flag. And that I would say that in any area of medicine, not just OBGYN, if it's a knee surgeon, if it's a back surgeon, if it's a foot doctor, if they're like, nope, this is how I've always done it. What I learned in medical school in 1965, this is how it's going to be done. That's so scary. I mean, that should be just, I don't know, Kara, maybe that needs to be red flag number one on top of everything.
Well, and you also hear, we don't let our moms go past 40 weeks because we want the goal of a live baby and a healthy mom. Isn't that what you want? Who says that to a pregnant woman who already has anxiety about everything going okay? We hear it over and over. And we call it the dead baby card because it's a way of coercing you into conforming to what they've always done and what they feel comfortable doing. That is not okay. For one, they're not giving you all of the other evidence and information that can lead to things that would hurt your baby or you. They're just saying, I never let, our practice does not. That is a huge red flag.
Yeah. And there's a couple of really good points in what you said, Kara. So the first is you will constantly hear us say evidence, evidence, evidence. And evidence-based care involves the most up-to-date research, the provider's clinical experience, and the patient's values and desires, right? So it needs to be a collaborative decision. It goes hand in hand with the shared decision-making that if it's only done according to the provider's preferences, there's no way that it's evidence-based care because it's not taking into account the most up-to-date research or the family's values or opinions.
Or the fact that you're a human being with choice. You're not a number.
Exactly. So then that's not evidence-based care. And then the other thing that you said that we say to our families over and over and over and over and over and over again, is that there is no provider, nurse, doctor, midwife on this planet who cares more about the well-being of your baby than you do. And wanting maybe less intervention or an unmedicated birth or something like that does not mean you don't care about the well-being of your baby. People tend to, when we talk about birth and they sort of pit like natural birth moms against parents who want more medicated birth experiences, they tend to pit them against each other and act like, well, if you accept all of the medications and all of the interventions, you care about the health of your baby. And if you want a natural birth, you don't. No, the two are not mutually exclusive. You can want a more natural, more hands-off birth experience and care about the well-being of your baby. In fact, what the evidence constantly leads back to is most of the time when you are healthy and your baby is healthy, doing less in many situations leads to better outcomes. So I want you to get the idea out of your head that your provider somehow cares more about you and your baby being healthy coming out of this than you do, because that is something you will often hear. Well, at the end of the day, we just want a healthy mom and healthy baby, which is so infantilizing and dismissive. So because I maybe don't want an epidural, I don't want a healthy mom and healthy baby. That's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. And I want you to always keep that in mind. As Kara said in the beginning of the episode, you are parents. You are not just patients. You are hiring these people to help you have your baby, but they are not parenting your child. They are not your parent.
And they don't have to recover from the birth of your child because you're going home with everything emotional, how that helped you, as well as the physical to heal from.
Yes. And policy is not law. And your provider's preferences do not have to be your preferences. You are allowed to say, hey, I'm cool with these things, but not these things, or I don't want any of that. And if they don't align with you and you don't align with them, that's where you look for support where you can find it that is more aligned with what you're looking for. And so the last thing that I want to just talk about is if you've ever felt pressured or guilted by a provider into having procedures, especially invasive ones like vaginal exams, vaginal ultrasounds, if you weren't comfortable with them, that type of pressure is incredibly violating. And I have seen many families, many parents that we've worked with accept these things that made them incredibly uncomfortable, upset, afraid, even sometimes in tears, out of this loyalty to their provider. I've worked with many parents through prenatal appointments together as a doula, where we're processing how they felt violated and scared even from the pressure they felt to undress or allow vaginal exams or allow certain testing, even like having blood drawn for a test that maybe they didn't feel comfortable with, or made to feel really guilty for declining certain fetal testing, again, made to feel like they don't care about the well-being of their baby. That's incredibly violating. And if you think about how many people go into having a baby with histories of trauma, assault, other areas of their life where they felt violated. And yet we're hiring these providers to support us in what is supposed to be the happiest experience of our lives, then continuing these patterns of violation and sometimes what can feel like assault. That's incredibly disheartening. And so if at any time you feel pressured into giving up your bodily autonomy or crossing your personal boundaries, or you don't feel safe in the presence of your provider for those reasons, see someone else. If it's just switching within the practice, because that's all you can do, switch within the practice. If that doctor walks into the birth room when you have your baby, ask for someone else, because you do not have to give up your personal safety, because nobody is entitled to be present in a medical room with you or at your birth. And I remember in my pregnancy, there was a fellow, a medical student who was working in our practice, and he didn't do anything like physically violating to me, but his absolute lack of knowledge about me, the type of pregnancy I had, the language he used when he talked about me and my pregnancy made me feel incredibly unsafe, unstable, unsupported, to the point where I went to the front desk after an appointment and I said, I never want that person in my room again, ever. This pregnancy is incredibly stressful. I am as high risk as it gets. I'm having so many babies, and I cannot continue to advocate for myself every appointment I come because this guy walks in and just completely makes me feel so unsafe, unseen, unheard, and misunderstood. That is not why I'm with this practice, and I'm not going to come here anymore if he continues to come into my room. And I never saw him again. And I always remind people of that you can always say, hey, that person is not allowed in my space or in my environment. If you have the ability to completely switch out of a practice that you experience these things that make you feel unsafe, do it. Because feeling safe is the most important piece of the puzzle when it comes to having a baby and reducing trauma, having a positive birth experience. If you feel unsafe, if you feel unseen, unheard, if you feel violated in any way, you do not feel safe with those people delivering your babies. And you have to put that at the top of your priorities above anything else, above any type of loyalty, above, oh gosh, navigating insurance is going to be so hard, I should just stick it out. No, don't stick it out for any other reason than because you want to be there.
And another thing too, when you talk about tests that I see a lot in later pregnancy, because obviously doctors get paid for every test that they can do for you, right? So those non-stress tests twice a week, when you have a very healthy pregnancy, you've had no hiccups, but they're going to start those at 38 weeks or 37 weeks or whatever. And I've had parents feel very pressured. They're like, I'm in perfect health. I've never eaten better in my life. My numbers are great. Why am I doing these tests? Well, because we want to make sure that it stays that way the rest of the pregnancy. Those parents are opting out of all those tests if they can. And when I say if they can, it's because they either find their voice around it or they don't. And a lot of times, if there's no medical evidence right now that anything's going awry, why am I doing this? And a lot of times that's to get you into induction because, oh, now we're seeing fluids drop, or now we're seeing this, or, oh, baby's heart rate decelled once. Whatever it is, if that practice is into induction, that's a very clear way to get you there. So if your pregnancy has been healthy and you are healthy, ask for the medical evidence with those tests. And I've had some moms say, hey, at 41 weeks and at 41 and a half, I'm happy to come in and start non-stress tests because then we're on the end of the scale. And usually they have their babies before then because babies usually come at 41.3 or earlier. So they are willing to do it when they feel like it's medically necessary, but not until. So once again, look at the pressure situation and find your voice around that. If it's something that's disturbing you, bothering you, or making you feel like you have to do this because your body's not capable of continuing the pregnancy or whatever.
Exactly.
So how do we get out of a practice or switch providers if we're past the 22-week date or whatever that our insurance will approve that, but you're not feeling safe, you're not feeling heard, etc.? A lot of times it's going to take some work with your insurance company to get that switch over. And I can give you a little tip with that. If you know earlier ahead of time, then it's pretty easy. You just call and say, I'm switching to this hospital with this doctor because it's closer to my house or whatever it is. It's really easy if you're early on to switch rather than later. But because of our global pay system for healthcare, the doctors get all of the money from your prenatal appointments after they catch your baby. So they are encouraged to keep you as long as possible, put off your birth plan ideas, all of that kind of stuff until the very end when you can't switch. That makes sense on a medical level or on a money level, but not on a medical level if you're not feeling safe, heard, or this is just not the right place for you to be. So I want you to think of this because it is a business. You're going to have to treat it as a business. It is a litigious business because OBs are sued more than any other profession. So you're going to have to speak the litigious language that they're all trained on. Now we're going to train you on it. If you are not feeling safe and heard and you call your insurance company and you say, I need to switch to my care to so-and-so doctor, blah, blah, blah. Why do you want to switch? Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm looking at your relative. I'm looking at your chart here and you're past the day for switching. So this will be the practice that you're at, or this is the hospital you're at. I'm not feeling safe. Ma'am, whatever, they're going to go through their whole thing. I want you to say, may I please get your name? Jesse. Great, Jesse. And I'm noting the time, 10:50 in the morning. Okay, Jesse, I've just told you that I'm not feeling safe. I'd like you to enter that into my notes. And now I would like you to transfer me to a supervisor because I'm going to talk to somebody else about switching. When we're starting to hear, I don't feel safe, I don't feel heard, blah, 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 all of those notes that are going in your record would also be entered into a court record if anything happens. They know that, and they are not going to take that chance. When we're talking about the squeaky wheel gets what they need, I'm not kidding you. And I've had families be on that insurance phone for a whole day until they finally got to the right people to say, okay, fine. But they've used the right language. I don't feel safe. I'm not feeling heard. What is your name? Great. What is the time? Please note that in my chart. That also works in the birth room, by the way. I've said no 2 times. Please note that in my chart. And what's your name? And I'm going to notate the time in my phone. Nobody wants that, right? So if you have to use that with your insurance company in order to switch, great. If not, and you're early in the game, you don't have to have a conversation with your doc to switch. You literally just get your new doc to request the medical records and they switch them over. You may have to go and sign, yeah, my medical record release. Great. You do not have to have a conversation with that doc, even if the doc requests it. You don't have to pick up the phone. You don't have to have any conversation at all. So know that it's not as scary as it is, because when I was going to switch, that was my big thing. I was like, I don't know how to say that to her. I don't want to have that conversation. I hate confrontation. And my midwife's like, you don't have to. Just go in, get your medical records, get a copy of them. They'll print them off. You bring them to us. You don't have to ask anybody. You're just going in to get your medical records. And it was that easy. And I never had to have that conversation. I was so paranoid about.
Yeah, I always tell people it does not have to be an awkward breakup. It's not like breaking up with an ex. They don't, and I don't want to say they don't care. That can be very dismissive of a lot of OBs, but I'm just being totally honest. They have hundreds of patients. And especially in these larger practices, you're not going to be missed in the way you think you are, unfortunately. They have a lot of other people to take care of, and you finding someone else who's a better support to you isn't going to break them, I promise. And it's your peace of mind, your experience, your care is so much more important than a doctor's feelings. I can't even express how much more important it is than how they feel. But at the end of the day, you're usually just a number to them. So it doesn't impact them at all in the way that we would hope that it would.
And I think that is very surprising to so many parents, right, Ash? They think that they have this relationship and now they're the ones that are pulling out like a bad breakup. And this doc doesn't even remember them. Like when they're seeing 12, 20 patients a day, doom, back and forth, and then going in for surgery and then coming back, as a human, that would be hard to reset from. And there's a part of me that's no harm, no foul, because we have saturated our OBs with so many people in order to make money, pay their malpractice, pay their clinic fees, pay their insurance, and keep their home life going and pay off their medical debt of their own personal medical debt from school. Like, we've burdened that system just as much as the system is burdened. So at the end of the day, it's what makes you feel the most safe, the most protected from a parent point of view, not a patient point of view, but a parent point of view, and finding the right doc or midwife that fits you and your family's goals.
Exactly.
So hopefully this conversation today did not fill you with fear, but gave you a broader perspective on how you can manage the system, what words you should be listening to, and how you can feel more confident in who's going to be providing the services that you are paying for your baby's birth.
Well, if you have had any experience in changing providers, in navigating these red flags, anything that you want to share with new expectant families or families thinking about getting pregnant, leave it in the comments of this episode so we can help spread the word on how to have the birth that you're looking for.
Perfect. All right. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us today. And remember, it's your body, your choice, and finding your voice is your power. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us in all the places, and go to birtheducationcenter.com for our blog and more online education classes. And we'll see you next week.